Are we streaming? Is the streaming? It's streaming. Hey, it's good to see you. Welcome to my show. My name's John Carrier. I'm here on YouTube Live this morning talking about something, I'm going to say it's an FAQ that I get as a rabbi, a frequently asked question. 1 second. And that is, what's the deal with the Messiah? So today we're going to be talking about the word Messiah, which is kind of an anglicized version of the word Mashiach, which is Hebrew for anointed one. And we're going to talk all about some different, let's say, definitions of this word, whether you're a Jewish person or a Christian person, and why those differences are important. I get asked all the time, hey, Rabbi, what do Jewish people think about Jesus? Do they think Jesus was the Messiah? If not, why not? And what does Messiah mean anyway? So we're going to dive into that today in this YouTube live session, which is actually a live studio recording for the Jew Curious Show podcast. So if you thought we were just going to pop in and get all the answers in 90 seconds flat like on my Tanakh video, sorry about that. We're going to be going for about an hour, and I'm going to share some insights I have on this topic based on my own learning, based on some rabbis that have taught me, and I'm going to answer whatever questions people want to ask today in the chat. So before we get started, just going to see who's here. Always a lively bunch of familiar faces so far, and we always have some new people jump in as well. I'll say if you're a new person here, if you want to lurk, you know, you do you. However, if you want to ask your questions, just know that it will be taken in the spirit of love in which you asked it. And the people who typically follow this chat are the nicest people that I know, either online or IRL, as the kids say. Speaking of what the kids say in IRL and old things, my internet today feels a little bit like AOL from 1995 through a 14.4 kilobaud modem if I were on the moon. So I've just been noticing some slowness going here and there. Hopefully the lag won't be too bad, but I totally enjoy your being here. So we see, do my little romper room. We see Carmen. We see Jana. Hey, Jana, how you doing? Coming in from North Carolina. KG Wilcox is joining us. Her name is Karen, and she's coming in from the suburbs of Philadelphia. Carmen is here. Great to see you, Carmen. And CJ, nice to see you, CJ, coming from the UD. I don't know if that's University. Oh, Delaware. Okay, yeah. CJ is my friend from Delaware. From the UD Hillel. We're watching the Israeli election results come in. Hashem take the wheel. I think that's a good bumper sticker for today. Good to see Kathy here from California and Miriam from North Carolina. No, that's New Hampshire is what NH stands for. And so it's good to see everybody. All right. Just going to shake it out. It's a little bit warm in my apartment this morning. Let's see. Get more and more light on me so you can see how much I'm sweating. This is kind of a controversial topic, so I'm not going to lie to you. I'm a little bit nervous. I don't know how people are going to take this. And so the first thing I'm going to do is intro the show. Again, this is a live studio recording of a podcast. We're going to be here for about an hour. I'm going to share everything that I know about this topic in an hour or less. And I really want to take some questions from people in our live studio audience. So feel free to ask those questions, because if you ask them, you're not just helping yourself, you're helping somebody else who might be listening to the podcast later or watching this video later get their answer to that same question as well. So, all right. See, Caleb is in the house. Welcome, Caleb. All right. I'm just a little warm. I've been running again lately. I'm not even being chased by anybody, and I've been running again lately. So it's like you go to the gym in the morning and get all head up, and it takes me a little bit of time to cool down. And the coffee's not helping with that, but it's helping with some other things. Hold on. All right. Let's see. As Kathy says, it's okay, Rabbi John, the real Messiah won't need a do-over. So, okay. It's getting into some deep theology in very few words. So I really appreciate that. All right, so let's do this. Hero, have you ever wondered what... Red leather, yellow leather, unique New York, rubber baby buggy bumpers. It's my Ron Burgundy warm-up voice. Hero, if you are like some Jew-curious people, and I bet you are, you may be wondering what's the deal with the Messiah, or Mashiach, as they say in Hebrew. What did Jewish people think about Jesus? Was Jesus the Messiah? If not, why not? And if we're still waiting, what exactly are we waiting for? In today's episode, we are going to discuss the Jewish concept of Mashiach, or the Messiah, how it is different from the Christian concept for the same idea, and why that even matters in the first place, right after this bass. All right, going to take a little silence print here. We're going to count to 10 just to get a little sample of some background noise here in the suburbs of Los Angeles. All right, that is good radio. 10 seconds of doing absolutely nothing. Very engaging in YouTube analytics, I imagine. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Joey and the Hadar Ensemble, for those inspiring opening beats. Thank you so much to our live studio audience who is joining us today in YouTube land. And most of all, thank you, Hero, for listening to the Jew Curious Show. I am excited to learn with you, and today we're getting into a topic that I get asked about a fair amount. Like, I'll say, for somebody who went to grad school for Judaism, as the case may be, I get a lot of questions about Jesus. And so I'm not surprised by that necessarily. Jesus is very popular. So there are a lot of Christians who ask me, what did Jewish people think about Jesus? Do they believe that this person was the Messiah that the Hebrew scriptures allegedly prophesied? And if we don't, well, why not? What's the difference? Like, what's the gap there? And so today what I wanted to do, based on a couple of listener requests, is to talk about the Jewish concept of Messiah, or Mashiach, more appropriately in Hebrew, a word that means anointed one. You know, somebody who's had a little oil, somebody who's had a little oil drizzled on top of their head on purpose for a specific reason. How that differs from the Christian concept of Messiah in very deep historical, cultural, theological ways, and what that difference makes in Jewish practice and Jewish thought. Before we jump into that, let me just make a quick recommendation that before we jump into that, let me somebody said earlier, the real Mashiach, somebody said earlier, the Mashiach will not need a do-over. So if you needed more evidence, I am not Mashiach. This is a radio program for which I do a lot of do-overs. So this is the benefit of the live show, is you get all the bloopers. The benefit of the podcast is you don't have to put up with them. In any case, before we proceed, I would like to make a small request, and that is that you hover your finger over a picture of a button on your smartphone that says subscribe. If you're listening to this on a podcast listening service, it most likely has a subscribe button. And if you tap that picture of that button, do you know what you'll get? You will auto-magically download every single future episode of this podcast. And you will have complete access to the full archive of the 30-plus episodes that we've done so far, depending on when you're listening to this. If you're listening to it far in the future, it might be 40-some episodes. Who knows? And all that will be lovingly delivered to your device without you doing any more work than tapping that button. It's like you've got your own podcast butler. So if you would like to indulge in this butlerian luxury in a podcast sense, please tap that subscribe button, then put the phone in your pocket, put it up on the dashboard of your car out of reach so you can concentrate on the road, people. and settle in for what I expect to be a pretty interesting conversation. This is kind of a controversial topic. People are going to feel very strongly about this, some people anyway. And in that vein, what I want to make super duper clear is that what I am not here to do today is assault Christianity or attempt to debunk anybody's personal beliefs or religion, sway you one way or the other. My only goal is to illuminate how Jews think about my only goal here today is to illuminate how Jewish thought deals with the topic of Moshiach or Messiah, especially in the context of eschatology or the end times, and how that's different from the Christian context, and why that difference matters for Jewish people. So if you're coming in believing one thing, you can come out believing the same thing. I'm not here to bust anybody's chops or myths or whatever. Just here to teach a little bit of Judaism, as I try to do as often as possible to Jew-curious people such as yourself. Before we proceed, I would like to give some shout-outs to the people who have shown up today in the live studio audience here on YouTube. Today, first dibs, hi from Carmen Lopez is here. Jana Campbell is here from North Carolina. Karen is coming in from the suburbs of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly, or let's say siblingly love in an egalitarian way. CJ is coming in from the University of Delaware, Hillel, where they are watching Israeli election results come in. And he says, Hashem, take the wheel. Always, I think, a good bumper sticker in times of, let's say, tough decisions. We like to call on Hashem to say, I know it's on me to drive this car myself, but if you can give me a little direction, be grateful for that, or give me some grace if I make the wrong decision. Kathy's coming in from Northern California. Miriam from New Hampshire. Even nicer than the old Hampshire. Good to see Caleb in the house. Susan Bird from Florida. Val is also from Florida. Val is here. Nicole is here from Edmond, Oklahoma. Welcome, Nicole. Not sure I've seen you here before. If I did and I forgot, I'm terribly sorry. I do that sometimes. And CJ chimes in, Oklahoma, because he's originally from Tulsa. Alrighty, we have got a, what is going on here? Lost my chat. Like I said, some slow internet today, but I'm seeing people come back in. Okay. Nicole shares that she recently attended a Jewish funeral service, has her very intrigued about Judaism. As an adult, turned her life over to believe in Jesus Christ as her Savior, but am open to always searching for a greater understanding of truth. Really appreciate that great attitude. So you are most welcome here as a Jew-curious person, as is everybody else out there, including the lurkers. If you want to lurk in your lurkum, that's okay too. But I'll ask you to be brave and ask what questions you have, if you have any questions. And the reason I really push for that is if you have a question, hero, chances are somebody else has that question too. And if you ask it, not only do you get the benefit of an answer, I won't say the answer because it's me talking here, but an answer anyway. Not only do you get an answer, but everybody out there listening to this podcast or watching this video who has the same question gets an answer too. So by being brave, you can help another shy person learn. All right, let's get into it. And I will say, while we are chatting, everybody feel free to ask what questions you have. I'll go back over the chat and catch those questions as I can. Excuse me. I do have a list of some things that I want to talk about, but I'm happy to be sidetracked with tangents and whatnot. So I'll go through a few points that I want to share, and then we'll just open it up to a conversation for which I am super duper excited. So let's do this. So I want to take an approach that Maimonides takes when talking about God. And that is, and maybe this is the wrong approach, but when's that ever stopped me? So let me think about it this way. So, Hero, I want to take a risky move here because we're about to talk about the Jewish idea of Messiah and what Messiah means to us. And it's risky because I want to tread into the philosophy of Maimonides, who, when talking about God, says you can only define God in the negative, as in what God is not, right? Because anytime that you try to ascribe positive attributes to God, you limit that which should not be limited, right? If you say that God is one and make a positive statement, you are limiting God to your idea of oneness. What Maimonides would say instead is that God is not multiple. So fine distinction, but works for Maimonides. So we're going to talk more about what Jewish Messiah is not. We're going to talk about. So as I go through. So what I want to do today, fully acknowledging that the Jewish idea of Messiah is very different and separate from God, I'm going to take a similar approach that Maimonides takes. I'm going to take a similar approach to that which Maimonides takes when talking about God, even though Mashiach and God are not the same thing in Judaism. Just because this is how it makes most sense to me to talk about the Jewish concept of Messiah. And there's a few things that I believe, based on my learning, based on my conversations with a couple of Orthodox rabbis recently for the Jew Curious Show podcast, there are a few things that I feel pretty confident in saying that the Jewish Messiah is not. The first thing is that in Jewish thought, the Messiah, and I'll go back and forth between using Messiah and Mashiach. Messiah is an English word for a Hebrew word, Moshiach, which means anointed one. The first thing that we can say about Mashiach is that Mashiach is not singular. And what I mean by that is that if you go into Jewish history, if you go into the text of the Torah and the Tanakh, specifically because it gets into the times of the prophets, specifically the books of Samuel, where there are multiple people, human beings in our narrative who are referred to as Mashiach well before the notion of the Christian idea of Mashiach. Saul, or Shaul, the king, the first king of the Hebrew people in Judea, was known as Mashiach, or Hamelech HaMashiach. He was an anointed king. That is, he was selected by God and by the prophets and by the people. Everybody sort of agreed on this person being the king to lead the Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people who were around at that time. And part of the process of being publicly recognized as king was a public anointing, right? He had oil, a specific formula of oil sprinkled on top of his head. Some people use crowns, some people, wear a fancy necktie or something like that. But how we recognized kings or sovereigns in those days was this person was anointed, and presumably, if they were anointed, they were probably qualified. In Saul's case, the Jewish people were asking for a king because they were having trouble with self-governance, and they go to Samuel, and Samuel says that's a terrible idea. Kings just louse everything up. Besides, you already have a king, and that's God. But then God said, no, give him a king. Right? Let's see. They asked for a king. I'm not, they're not looking to me as the king, so let's give them a human king and see how that goes for everybody. And so Saul was selected. He was, very skilled in battle. He was allegedly about a head taller than everybody else in his neighborhood, so he seemed like a good fit, and he was anointed king. Likewise, later on, his successor, David, was anointed as king. And so there are multiple appearances of somebody being called Moshiach, which doesn't make them the Messiah or the singular redeeming Savior of the Jewish people. So that's the first point, is that when we use the word Mashiach, we're not necessarily talking about an eschatological figure, savior, redeemer. We are talking about a human ruler. And that gets me to my second point, which is that in the Jewish concept of Messiah, Messiah is not supernatural, right? It's not a person who was born of a virgin birth or has special powers to multiply food, doesn't really do any kind of things that are beyond human capacity. I mean, they may be pretty great. You know, Saul was super tall. David was really good at music and the slingshot and guiding battles. Still didn't get to build the temple. That was for a different reason. But so he was a pretty upstanding guy. You know, he was a good shot. And he was, you know, handsome and popular and all these things, but he was human, right? And Saul was human. And we've had kings who were human, you know, really good humans. We've had some really terrible humans as kings. If you look through, let's say, the Book of Kings, for example, but all of them were human. So in our concept of Messiah, Messiah is not a singular figure to end all need, and is not supernatural. And even once you accept the humanity of Mashiach, then there's another idea that comes at you, that the Mashiach is not perfect. This is the third thing, is that our concept of Messiah is not a perfect, flawless, sinless being. Again, when we look at the other instances of Mashiach in the Hebrew text, like Saul, dude had a bit of a temper. You know, they say, they're saying a lot these days, it's not right for psychiatrists to diagnose people from a distance without talking to them. But Saul seems to fit the kind of bipolar personality disorder framework pretty well. At least he was, we'll say, moody and was paranoid about his successors. David, who, you know, even when we think about Mashiach in more eschatological terms in Judaism, and we do, I mean, we say that Mashiach comes from David. David was far from perfect, right? Even in his day of his greatest triumph, where he's bringing the Ark of the Covenant back into Jerusalem, and he's dancing around like a fool, or at least that's what his wife Michal says to him. And just, you know, did the king, you know, do himself great honor today, dancing around like a fool in front of the Ark of the Covenant? And then he comes back with a snappy retort and said, hey, you know, who's the king? I'm the one who deposed your father, so you can make fun of me all day long, but I'm the king here and not you and not your family. And then it said that they never had a kid after that. I mean, this guy, so, you know, Michal was perhaps a little bit off base. I'm not going to say that David was any better in his kind of response, and he broke that marriage. And then later he broke that marriage, let's say a little further, with that whole thing with Bathsheba, right? Nice lady, Solomon's mother, but that wasn't the normal way of a couple getting together, right? He had temptation. He sinned. And so when we talk about anointed leaders, we don't require that they be perfect, sinless human beings in order to do great things for us, even in, let's say, as I said before, eschatological or end times, olam haba kind of, you know, this Messiah that's going to usher in an era of peace. There's no requirement in Jewish thought that this be some sort of magical, perfect, sinless being. Insofar as it's a person, and we'll get back to that later. This person could be a sinner, could be flawed, will be human, right? And not only that, and this was a lesson that I got from a couple of rabbis. One is Rabbi Mark Wilds of the Manhattan Jewish Experience, whom I interviewed on an early episode of the Jew Curious show, and also was sort of reinforced with and was also sort of reinforced with a conversation that I had with Brad Hirschfield. Don't remember if that was on the podcast or off the podcast, but they both gave me insight into, let's say, the messianic family tree. So part of, and somebody was asking earlier about Jewish prophecies about this end times hero, this end times Messiah. Ingrained in that is a belief that this will be a continuance of the lineage of David, right? The Messiah, such as he is, or she, for that matter, if you ask me, will come from the line of David. And who is David? This very not perfect being, let's say. I mean, he had his ups and downs. He did some really good stuff. He did some really negative stuff, for which he often paid the price and sometimes did not. But ultimately, he was human. And if you go even back farther into the family tree, it gets way less perfect. What we know about the yichus, or the pedigree, or genealogy of David, is that he comes from the union of Ruth and Boaz. And we read all about that in the book of Ruth. Highly recommended. And on both sides of that family tree, they had some imperfections as well. If you go back through Boaz, let's keep it to the fatherly line for right now. Boaz was the descendant of Perez, and Perez was one of the twin sons of Judah and Tamar. And if you look up the story about how those two crazy kids got together, it was also not a match made in heaven. This was not like a successful outcome of the dating game or any kind of storybook romance that anybody could imagine. This was actually about Judah taking advantage of Tamar, and some would say Tamar taking advantage of Judah, but both of them were in kind of a bad situation. Judah was Tamar's father-in-law and had married his oldest son to Tamar. That guy died, and by ancient law of Yibum, or levirate marriage, Judah's second son married Tamar, and he died. And so by Jewish law, Judah was supposed to give over his third son to Tamar, and he did not, and stalled and refrained and dodged his responsibility until Tamar decided the only way she was going to get justice was to disguise herself as a prostitute and wait for Judah to come to town during sheep shearing time. And she did, and he did, and they had a kid. And I won't say it was all bad. There was one good thing that came out of it when Tamar confronted Judah as a pregnant lady who was also his daughter-in-law. He says, "You're bringing shame on the family. How dare you? How could you do this?" Like, not knowing that he was responsible for it. And then she showed him that he was responsible for it. And the one good thing is that he could have erased this whole problem. He could have had her killed. And in fact, he was threatening that before he knew the score. And instead, he confessed, right? Instead, he said, "Okay, look, now I see that I did wrong. I'm going to make tshuva. I'm going to make everything right by you. And, whatever kids you have, I'm going to take care of as if they are my own." And often, Judah's penchant for tshuva, or repentance, is given credit for things like the fact that one of the few tribes that remained were the tribe of Judah, right? We are called Jews today because Judah knew how to say he was sorry when he made mistakes, and he did make several. So this is where Perez comes from, which is where Boaz comes from, which is where David comes from, which is where Mashiach comes from. So not to further air family dirty laundry, but where does Ruth come from? Now, Ruth, this wonderful young woman who, despite all evidence and urging to the contrary, aligns herself with the Jewish people. First off, this says that Mashiach comes from David, comes from a mother who's not even part of the tribe originally. But even more than that, she is from Moab. And where does Moab come from? what we know about where Moab comes from, and Moab was sort of a historical enemy of the Jewish people, which is probably why we tell this story about where Moab comes from. Moab is the Moabite people who originated with this person named Moab was the offspring of Lot, or Lot, Abraham's nephew, you know, the whole Sodom and Gomorrah thing. He escaped the city. His wife gets killed. His sons-in-law get killed, but he escapes with his daughters. And his daughters conspire to have children by their father. That's where Moab comes from, which is where Ruth comes from, which is where David comes from, which is where Mashiach comes from. So, again, I can't really see a starker counterpoint to this narrative of a perfect, immaculately conceived notion of Mashiach than someone who's got as opposed to the Jewish idea, which is someone who comes from, let's say, the roughest, most human, occasionally dark family tree that you can possibly imagine. And so we're not looking for a perfect king. We're not looking for a perfect Mashiach. We're not looking for a perfect Mashiach. We're acknowledging human reality that people are flawed, but they are perfectible, that they can turn their lives around, that they can become great leaders even from humble beginnings and a history of past failures, as it were. So that's the third thing. First, Mashiach is not singular. There have been lots of those in our history. Mashiach is not supernatural, coming from a source other than regular human procreation. Mashiach is not perfect. Even if you accept the humanity of Mashiach, you also have to accept that it doesn't have to be a perfect person, and certainly doesn't have to have perfect genealogy. And the fourth major difference between the Jewish idea of the fourth major difference between the Jewish idea of Messiah and the Christian idea of Messiah is that this Mashiach is not required for personal redemption. We do have a notion of Mashiach who will be available for us for national redemption. That is, in our darkest time of war, will usher in an era of peace for all people. However, we don't make any claim that that Mashiach is necessary for the redemption of a singular individual human being. And this goes back very far in our text to the Garden of Eden, to this, let's say, the first major boo-boo that humans make. The first, some people would say the first sin. Some people will say the first sin, or even the original sin of Eve and Adam taking a bite out of a piece of forbidden fruit in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden. And my understanding is that, and my understanding of the Christian take on that narrative is that because of that original sin, human beings are forever stained at such a level that they cannot redeem themselves personally. There's lots of times you can make a mistake, you can make amends, you can make up for that mistake, you can pay back what you owe, you can pay damages, you can make amends with human beings, you can make amends to God for individual things that you did, but no matter how hard you try, you can't wash off that original sin. And the only thing that can do that for you is Mashiach, is the Messiah, is this belief that because of this ultimate suffering, Jesus and Jesus alone could take away that original sin. And so for one very popular human religious tradition, human beings are incapable of fully redeeming themselves from sins that they inherited without the intervention of Mashiach, which is not necessary in the Jewish narrative because we see that story of Gan Eden very differently. And I'm going to say there's not one singular Jewish view on this. However, how I take it and how many parts of the Jewish tradition take it is that this error, and it was a sin. Like, God told them not to do it, and they did it, and there was a consequence. They got kicked out of the garden, and they were no longer, eternally cared for. I'm not going to say that they didn't do a bad thing. However, it wasn't a sin that permanently marked humanity that needed someone else to come along and absolve them. Instead, how many Jews view this episode is God's gift to humanity of free will, right? If you want to get technical about it, God put this tree in the garden, and it wasn't the free will tree, it was the knowledge of good and evil tree. And when they ate the fruit, suddenly Adam and Eve could see the difference between good and evil, which forevermore gave them the responsibility to choose between those things, and being given the responsibility is what gave them free will. And so this original, and I'm going to say, small o, small s, this original sin, this initial error in human action, also gave us forevermore moral responsibility and free will, but it did not stain us in a way that we could not redeem ourselves and required an intercessor. And so, again, when we're talking about Mashiach, we're talking about something very different. We're not talking about the one way that we can access heaven. We are talking about a person, a human being, not supernatural, not perfect, who will come when our people need it to help restore us to safety and peace, and in some imaginations will restore the entire earth to an era of peace. And I think that is a major difference. The Mashiach is not a personal savior in Jewish thought. The Mashiach, insofar as he or she is a savior, is a collective savior, most likely a military leader or a political leader who saves our people and maybe even all of humanity through their, let's say, divinely inspired or selected human leadership. Another way in which, a fifth way in which the Jewish concept of Messiah, and this is again not uniformly accepted in Judaism, almost nothing is, we've got a lot of diversity of opinion, but one notion is that this Mashiach may not even be a person. Right? There are those who read Isaiah and read the other bits of the Tanakh which seem to prophesy the coming of a leader who will help us in our time of need. But there are some later reads on that says, okay, maybe this Messiah isn't a person, but a kind of universal enlightenment. Maybe Messiah is not a human, but an age, right? A time in which, after sufficiently working together and sufficiently letting go of our darkness, letting go for our need for selfishness and violence and anger and revenge, once enough of us can let go of that, there will be a tipping point into an era of peace. And so there are those, I'll say, modern theologians who look at the concept of Messiah and they say, well, this is an age of peace that will come about because of collective human action or even divine intervention, but it won't necessarily be a flesh and blood human being, divinely sourced or entirely biological, who will do this for us. It could just be something that we bring about ourselves. There is a Jewish concept that, I forget where this came from, but there was a Jewish author who wrote, on the Sabbath on which every Jew in the world keeps the Sabbath, that's when Mashiach will come, right? And maybe he's just setting this as an impossible standard because there are Jews who keep the Sabbath, there are those who don't, there are people who keep it in lots of different ways. And in this guy's imagination, on the day in which all Jews could rally together and come to do the same thing at the same time, maybe his idea was Mashiach would be inspired by that and suddenly show him or herself. Or maybe if there was an event on which all Jews agreed and could come together for common purpose, we wouldn't need Mashiach anymore, but the era of peace and understanding that we would usher in that point would itself be a messianic age. So this is a lot to take in. There's a lot of different concepts that may be new for some people. It's certainly things that I've discovered over the last few years in my own studies and my speaking with Christians and Jews of all stripes in my own study. I just wanted to point again. I just want to say again, I'm not here to debunk Christianity or to challenge other people's beliefs. What I wanted to do is to set the record straight on what Jews mean when they use the word Messiah and how it's different from what Christians mean when they use the word Messiah, to hopefully bridge some gaps of understanding. I get asked with fair regularity, including on stage last summer by a friend of mine who is an Anglican priest, the scriptures right there, there's prophecy in Isaiah and so forth that talks about the coming of a figure. Christians believe that this prophecy was fulfilled in the person of Jesus. Why don't Jews accept that? And so I shared with him some of the things that I've shared with you, as well as some additional answers that we have to this question, as in, our concept of an end times Messiah includes an era of peace, and that did not happen in the lifetime of Jesus. And we believe that it would be the Mashiach altering. We believe that, and we believe that it would be Mashiach ushering in an era of peace in his or her lifetime, a kind of global unity that did not happen at the time. And I know there's an alternative Christian answer to that, and I accept that for Christians. But how we think about it turning out is not how it turned out from our perspective. So I wanted to share some of those things today just to increase some understanding, to more bridge gaps than create them. I don't know if I've accomplished that. I'm going to take a look at the chat and find out, see who I have upset. So let's take a look, and I'll encourage. This can get along a lot of strong feelings, and so I'm going to try to be. Please, if I'm a little awkward, I'm just trying to be as sensitive as I can be. But I'll certainly say, if you're in the chat and people are chatting with each other, as often happens here, I'll ask you to be as sensitive as you can be with each other as well. And let's conduct this possibly controversial conversation in a concept and spirit of love and understanding. So I'm just going to say that once. I don't often say that because I trust this group to be very kind to one another, as you always have been. So I wanted to set that intention because I think it's really important. Okay, so let's go back into the chat. And I think we have inspired some questions and thoughts. All righty. So just scrolling up to the chat, please bear with me. The chat skips around a little bit, and if I skip your question, if I miss it, I really apologize. I'll try to get to as many as I can. Hello, Milo. Good to see you coming in from Denmark. Nicole is a new face in the crowd, asks a couple of, vocabulary question. What is Maimonides? Maimonides is the sort of Hellenized name of Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, which means Moshe, son of Maimon, and the Greek way of saying son of Maimon is Maimonides. He was a Jewish scholar, rabbi, physician, scientist, philosopher of approximately the 11th century of the Common Era, spent a lot of his life in Muslim Spain and around the Mediterranean, but he was a sort of a great pillar of Jewish philosophy and a legal scholar as well. So that's who Maimonides is. And I asked, and she also asked, who is hero? So if you're just tuning in, you may hear me call people heroes. That's what I think of when I think of the listeners to the Jew Curious Show podcast and also the viewers on this YouTube channel. I call you heroes to make it clear that you are my heroes, because I think everybody who's coming to this kind of learning is somebody who is clearly on a quest is on a spiritual journey, maybe just not that big a quest. Maybe it's a day hike. I don't know. But you are questing for something. You're curious about something. And in your journey, you are the hero. And I just want to make sure everybody knows I am not. I am here as a guide. I'm not looking for, any kind of leadership status here necessarily. But I really think that for every person who is learning, you are the hero of your story. And I am just here to support that journey with whatever wisdom, facts, with whatever wisdom or facts or trivia or insight or knowledge I can share with you. That's my role. And so I call you heroes because I really want everybody here to own their own journey and see themselves as the hero of their own story. If you want to hear more about that, listen to episode 0 of the Jew Curious Show podcast. Miriam asked, didn't Maimonides also write the 13 Articles of Faith and be kind to converts and everyone, of course? Yes, he did write those things. He laid out the 13 articles of Jewish faith that are often included in Sidurim and during prayer services and things like that. He did encourage people to be kind to converts. He wrote a great letter to a student of his named Ovadia, also known as Ovadia the proselyte, who was a convert, who had asked Maimonides, is it okay for me to say things like the God and God of our fathers, or this is my God, or there's a particular prayer that starts with, my father was a wandering Aramaean, talking about Abraham. And Ovadia, who was a convert, asked his teacher Maimonides, can I say this if Abraham wasn't legit my biological ancestor? And Maimonides, who was, I'm going to say, not a liberal guy. I mean, he was a pretty strict interpreter of Jewish law. And yet he said to Ovadia, you can absolutely call yourself Ovadia ben Avraham, the son of Abraham. You are as much a part of this people as if you had been born to this people. And we are not faking it. We are not making things up when we say Avram Avinu, Abraham, our father, including my father, because there's different kinds of parentage. In the sense there's genetic parentage, but there's also intellectual parentage. And everybody who accepts the covenant of the Jewish people is as if they, is in essence entering the tent and the community started by Abraham and should count themselves as such. And you are just as legitimately a part of this people as Abraham was, who himself became, let's say, quote unquote, Jewish. That word wasn't invented for, millennia afterwards, but himself became Jewish around age 75. And so that was what he had to, so that's what Maimonides had to say to Ovadia. Once you become Jewish, according to the standards of the community you want to belong to, you are just as Jewish as if you had been born, to 10 or 20 generations of rabbis, let's say. So let's take a look, looking for some questions. Really appreciate everybody being kind to one another here. Nicole asks, from a Jewish perspective, do you believe that there was a man named Jesus that claimed to be the Messiah? Or let me rephrase. I think I stumbled a little bit. Nicole asks, from a Jewish perspective, do you believe that there was a man named Jesus that claimed to be Messiah? So I can't speak for all Jews here. There are a lot of Jews I know who will cop to the idea that there was indeed a person named Jesus, although that comes from a Romanization of what was probably an Aramaic name, Jesus, which may have come from either Yeshua is a very popular word for that. It might have actually been Yehoshua, which is spelled almost exactly the same way. So it might have been more like Joshua. I'm not sure. In any case, most Jews I know will say, yes, we seem to have ample evidence that this human being existed, that he was probably part of the, let's say, Pharisee denomination because he studied in study halls like the Pharisees did. And much of what he taught was very similar to what was being taught in Pharisaic houses of study. I'm of two minds about whether he himself claimed to be Messiah or whether that possibly might have been attributed to him posthumously by followers, because it's my understanding that the Gospels didn't really emerge until decades after his death. And I'll just make one bit of commentary again. This isn't me dinging Christians. I'm not trying to convince anybody to believe one way or the other. I will make a historical observation about many instances of claim to messiahhood. There were other people in Jewish history throughout the last couple of millennia who claimed to be Messiah. Many of them personally claimed to be Messiah. And I'm thinking specifically of the Shabtai Tzvi, or another fellow named Jacob Frank in, let's say, I believe, I want to say the 17th and 18th centuries, respectively. These people themselves claim to be Messiah, and a lot of people believe them. When the Shabtai Tzvi was working, it's thought that at least half of the Jewish world at his time were convinced that he was in fact the Messiah. And Jacob Frank, same deal. And when they turned out to be false, because Shabtai Tzvi converted to Islam at the point of, on pain of death, and Jacob Frank disavowed Judaism and became a Christian. And this left people in a terrible funk, because when these people got popular, it was at a time of great desperation. 16th, 17th century Christian Europe was not a pleasant place for Jews to live insofar as we were allowed to live. And many times that was taken away from us as well. And when times get tough, when we seem to not be able to pull ourselves out of the mire that we are in, those are the times that are most fertile for a claim to messiahhood. And if I've got my math right, if the Gospels are coming out, let's say 30 to 40 years after Jesus died, this was another very dark period for Jewish people. This was right around the destruction of the Seventh Temple, right around the destruction of the Second Temple in around 70 of the Common Era, getting into the Bar Kokhba revolt, which wound up getting all Jews expelled from the Holy Land in like the 90s. I want to say like 92 to 96 of the Common Era. So this was a dark time. It makes sense to me that disciples of Jesus would say, hey, I think this guy was onto something, and may have written the books in such a way as to attribute claims of messiahhood to Jesus. But I'm not going to say they didn't take down the dictation faithfully, and maybe Jesus claimed to be Messiah. Maybe he didn't. I'm skeptical about that point. And so there are those Jews who believe that Jesus existed and claim to be Messiah. There are Jews who believe that he existed and did not, in fact, claim to be Messiah, but that was attributed to him by followers who really needed for it to be true. And maybe it was. I'm going to go to a teaching that I got from Rabbi Nolan Leibovitz, who got it from someplace else, I'm sure. Look, I might be totally wrong. I'm willing to accept that when Mashiach comes, and this is what I learned from Rabbi Nolan, I'm going to ask him or her, is this your first time here? And if Mashiach says no, then okay, I'm going to rethink a lot of things that I've had to think about for the course of my life. If the Messiah says yes, then maybe I've been right about certain things. And so I don't know, and I can't know. I just live my life in such a way as to follow a narrative and follow a legal system and to follow a people, tribe, civilization that makes the most sense to me. And so that's a long answer, probably more than you were asking for, but I don't think anybody really dismisses the historicity of the person Jesus. There were certain discussions about Jesus, even in the Talmud, most of which have been excised because these were used by Christian leaders, or rather leaders who were Christians, to kill us. to say that we were saying bad stuff about Jesus, and they used that to wipe out whole towns of ours. And so much of the record of Jewish writing about Jesus from classical times has been expunged to save our life, let's say. So, yes, so Miriam weighs in. Yes, a lot of people claimed to be Messiah back then, as now. It's a popular thing. If you think you can, and maybe people believe themselves to be a Messiah, and maybe it worked out, maybe it did not. Jana shares, from my Jewish perspective, I do not believe there was one man named Jesus that claimed to be Messiah. I don't think that Jesus existed. So that's another Jewish answer. I'll say again, you have two Jews, you have three opinions. At which point, one of my teachers said, "Why do you need two Jews for that? You can have three opinions with one Jew." Miriam asks, how can the Messiah come as long as countries are at war with each other? Again, divided ideas. Maybe Messiah will come and stop the wars, or maybe it's our stopping the wars that will cause the Messiah to come. Jason, my buddy from Ireland, I believe, shares Jesus, a radical rabbi at a specific time and location, whose life story was then taken by Paul, who then put it into place, a man-made religion to control wealth and society. I'll say if Paul was there to control wealth and society, he didn't do a great job in the beginning, but later on, I think the Romans adopted it, and that's what made it pretty successful. Again, I'm barely an expert on Judaism. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on the history of Christianity. Nicole shares, I was pointed toward Josephus, that wrote about a man named Jesus who was hung on a cross and died for claims to be the king of the Jews. Yes, I think Josephus wrote about Jesus as well. The farther back you go in history, the more the history is based on narrative and oral tradition, which can be very reliable, but maybe not as reliable as historical record. Listen, I believe in a lot of stuff that we don't have the receipt for, let's say. So I'm totally willing to go with that. Victoria shares, Rabbi Skobach, Jews for Judaism, has some good lessons on this also. I learned a lot about the Jewish understanding of Mashiach, Messianic age, sin offerings, etc. Very helpful. Daniel shares, anybody notice how in Catholicism God gets further and further from the people, need a Messiah to get to God, and Jesus is apparently so holy we need his mother Mary, and then further with saints, priests, etc. I will say no commentary or deep insight on intercessory figures in different Christian denominations. I will say that within Judaism, one thing that we prize is not getting in between people and God, right? Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, a couple hundred years ago, famously said that you should talk to God like you talk to a friend, that there should be no intermediary figure between a human being and God talks to humans in the Torah all the time. People have different perspectives on that, whether it's actual, historical, metaphorical, what have you. But at no time did God put a human being between God and another human being. One may look at the priests and say, is that true? We had the priests offering sacrifices in the temple. I follow the school of thought of Maimonides and later commentaries on Maimonides' teaching that the role of the priests wasn't to stand in between human beings and God. The role of the priests was to limit who was doing sacrifices, in the sense that when we began sacrificing in order to mediate our sins between us and God, or to give thanks or what have you, we were coming from an idolatrous tradition where everybody did sacrifices, and God instituted the priesthood, and said, look, only the priests are going to do sacrifices and only the Levites are going to have this kind of holy responsibility, and you hand your animals over to the priests and then the priests do something with them, that wasn't to say that you're incapable of talking to God. It was to say that you are no longer allowed to sacrifice whatever you feel like, right? You are no longer allowed to do this. I'm putting all of that in the hands of the priests. And some would say this presages the loss of the temple, at which point we were ready to give up sacrifices because sacrifices had been limited into the hands of the priests and the location of the temple. So we were ready to move on from that with what the Pharisees were doing after the first temple period. And then that's also why the Pharisees endured after the second temple period as well. But I just want to jump in here just to, let's see, I'm going to take a little sip here. This is kind of a longer conversation. For example, I'm going to admit this, I'm often frustrated by being treated like a priest. And it doesn't happen that often. like reduce the size of my ego a little bit. But I'll say that many Jewish people and not Jewish people approach rabbis like they would approach a priest or an intercessory figure or a magician or something like that. Like they need rabbis in their lives in order to connect to God. Now, for other reasons, I think people need rabbis in their lives. I think it's good to have a teacher, but that's all a rabbi is a teacher. They're not an intermediary between you and God. They're just somebody who's probably spent a little more time than you studying, so that if you want to learn, that rabbi is there as a guide to set you on the right path. And you can have many different rabbis in your life, learn from lots of different people. But just to expand on this theme of Judaism rejecting intercession or the necessity of intercession or mediating between a human being and God, even our religious figures, our clergy, as it were, and we've kind of adopted a lot of habits of Protestant ministers and pastors who adopted a lot of habits from Catholic priests, let's say. We don't have that same kind of theological role. As they say, it takes... I had a little brain fog there for a second. But a rabbi is no more holy an individual or have any more special powers than any single Jewish person. About the only thing that you need a rabbi for, you don't need him to lead services, you don't need him to run a wedding or a funeral or make blessings over wine and bread or grace after meals. About the only thing you need a rabbi for is if you're convening a Beit Din for some area of communal law. The two that I was on yesterday, in fact, was on a Beit Din for conversion, because you need 3 teachers versed in Jewish law and teaching to question people who want to enter the Jewish community, right? And the only reason it's rabbis, and it's not always rabbis, sometimes there are dayanim or judges on the Beit Din who are not rabbis per se, but you just need 3 educated people to ask questions to ascertain sincerity for someone to join the community. Not because we're changing their status in a holy way necessarily, but because they want to join the community, and so we represent the community in that regard. And the other thing you might need a Beit Din for is Jewish divorce, right? The Beit Din has to witness that the Beit Din has to release a husband from any potential vows that might annul the validity of a get. And again, it's a little bit inside baseball, but you don't need rabbis for just about anything Jewish unless they're adjudicating some matter of Jewish law on behalf of the Jewish community, but nothing to do with getting between a human being and God. So let's see what else is going on. We've been going for about an hour now, so I'm going to wrap it up pretty soon, but I want to make sure I cover whatever questions I can, because this is an important topic to people. Let's see. So I want to take a look in the chat and make sure, because I really appreciate the frank and loving conversations that people are having with each other. So I just want to make sure in all of that I'm not missing any questions that people are asking. I just want to share, while I'm looking for a question, I'll just share something that Jason shared. Off topic, Netflix, Shtisel, 2 seasons, wonderful show. Check it out, peeps. I have to confess, as long as we're talking about religious stuff, I confess I have not seen Shtisel. And that's probably to my great discredit and cultural gap, but I plan to catch up on it pretty soon, maybe during Passover or something. So I've heard good things about Shtisel. Feel free to check that out. Okay, I often say that I'll stop. So I'll often say when I have students learn together that I'll stop their discussions as soon as they start talking about baseball. It's okay to talk about baseball. It's okay to talk about Shtisel. But I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up pretty soon. And listen, everybody, I really appreciate the frank questions that you've asked, the loving questions that you've asked, the loving answers that people have been giving each other, and especially in a topic that can be very near and dear to people's hearts, very personal. Everybody has their own personal experience with these kinds of disagreements and people trying to sway each other's views. And so, all the more so, I'm really grateful that this community of our live studio audience has dealt with this in a careful, loving, understanding, open way. That people have asked great questions, that people have asked great questions, that people have shared great TV shows, and have given a lot of high fives and shout outs. And so that's what I love about having a live studio audience. So I'll say to everybody in the audience, thank you for showing up today for this important and controversial topic. And most of all, thank you, Hero, for listening to the Jew Curious Show. If you'd like to take part in a future live discussion, please check out my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com, and then search for Rabbi John Carrier. You will see whatever live topics we have scheduled for the near future. Feel free to jump into any one of those. We do an Ask Me Anything on Mondays. We do a discussion of the weekly Torah portion on Fridays. And then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I just kind of pick a topic out of what people have asked me to do shows about. So if you have an idea for a topic, feel free to type it into the chat. So if you have an idea for the topic, feel free to reach out to me and let me know what you want to talk about. But just to be clear, I would really value your contribution to a live studio audience as it suits you. If you would like to get even more connected to other Jew Curious people just like you, I highly recommend the Jew Curious Community Center. This is a lovingly tended, carefully guarded, troll-free private Facebook community that you can join by going to jewcurious.show/JCC, as in Jew Curious Community Center. This is open to people who are Jewish, people who are not Jewish, people who are just, Jew curious, which could include spiritual seekers of all kinds and people very dedicated to other faiths who are just curious about the Jewish roots of their own tradition. All are welcome here for open discussions, and if you join the Jew Curious Community Center, you can share your stories, share your thoughts, share your concerns, and share your support with other people just like you. And you can join that once more by going to jewcurious.show/JCC. Hero, it has been my great honor to learn with you today, and until next time, peace. All right, everybody, that's the end of the recording of the show. I will hang out if people... I will hang out with people for as long as they want to discuss. I know there's some silence as I was looking through the different comments and things like that. Again, this is meant to be not a 3-minute jump cut, densely packed video with soundtrack and stuff like that necessarily, but more of an open discussion among, let's say, friends in scholarship and curiosity. And I really appreciate everybody's openness to learning and everybody's gentleness with what can be a controversial topic that really goes deep into people's identities. And so anytime we do that, it pays to be open-hearted and open-minded. And I set that intention at the beginning. I feel like it's really been borne out. So again, I'm not surprised with anybody here. I am terribly impressed. So thank you for doing this learning with us today. And let's see, so I want to jump on this idea because maybe this will be tomorrow's show. This week usually I plan the shows out a week in advance. This week I've been struggling a little bit with that and just doing stuff day by day. I think what I might do tomorrow, based on Nicole's comment here, humans are traditionally sinners, so I need more than traditions. Okay, so I appreciate that. What I do want to talk about is, while we don't have original sin, we do have a notion that, human beings are flawed and have an inclination toward, let's say, selfishness from birth, and that is a legitimate and native to the Jewish experience. It's not the same thing as original sin, but it's related. We've always dealt with these kinds of things. And so I'd like to offer the Jewish view of that and maybe some alternatives to vicarious expiation, for example. So we'll talk about the notion tomorrow, just to tease it a little bit. And not that I planned this, but Nicole and everybody's discussions have inspired me. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about Yetzer Hara and Yetzer HaTov. This is what we call the inclination toward evil and the inclination toward good, and how both of these are at home in the human soul. Both of these are legit, and there's even teachings that you can't just have one. I'll just share a little bit of it, that originally God created the universe and gave people only a good inclination, and humanity died out very quickly, because without what we call the Yetzer Hara, like the inclination toward wickedness, I tend to think of it more toward self-interest or selfishness. But without this Yetzer Hara, nobody had babies, right? Nobody farmed, because nobody was looking out for their own needs or trying to store away for the future. Nobody supported families. Nobody started businesses. Nobody felt like building a house. So it is this inclination toward selfishness and scheming and whatnot that allows us to feed our Yetzer HaTov. We'll talk more about that tomorrow, but we'll be on the air or on the interwaves in any case at 9 a.m. That's tomorrow, Wednesday, 9 a.m. Pacific time. Anybody who wants to join us for that discussion is most welcome. So thank you for the great idea for that. Really love whatever ideas you guys have coming out. And so, listen, everybody, thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us today, Nicole Attenberry. I really appreciate your participation. And for everybody who's been talking with Nicole, and Nicole who's been talking to everybody, I don't think it would have been as good a discussion today if you were not here sharing your heart. So thank you for doing that. All right, with that, heroes, I'm going to just hold my heart, just to hold all the gratitude in for a second before it explodes. I'm coming to join you, Elizabeth. It's my old Fred Sanford impersonation. And with that, I'm going to say, can't wait to learn with you again, heroes. And until next time, peace.